The box arrived at dawn. That was the first thing Lena noticed. Later, when she tried to reconstruct the sequence of events that had dismantled her life. Not the men who came to the door. Not her mother's voice, high and strange in the kitchen, saying words that didn't arrange themselves into meaning. The first thing she noticed was that it was dawn. That particular gray-blue hour when the world looks like it hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be, and she had been awake already, sitting at the window of their small house with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, watching the light change over the fields. She had not slept. This was not unusual. She had not been sleeping well for 3 weeks. Since her father's death had stopped being a private shame and started being a public one. Since the men had come the first time and spoken in low voices with her father in the yard, and her father had come inside afterward, looking like something had been removed from him. She did not know what they had said. She knew what it meant. The men who came at dawn were different from the first ones. These wore gray. Not the rough working clothes of debt collectors, but something more formal. Something that suggested they represented an institution rather than just a man. There were 2 of them. They were polite. That was the worst part. They were extremely polite, the way people are polite when they have already decided what is going to happen, and courtesy is just the shape they've chosen to put around it. Her father did not come out of his room. Her mother stood in the kitchen doorway, with her arms crossed over her chest, and her face doing something complicated that Lena had never seen it do before. Something that was not quite grief and not quite anger, and was perhaps both of those things pressed together until they became something without a name. The men explained the arrangement. Her father's debt to the Northern Territories, to the Dravian bloodline specifically, was considerable. It had been considerable for some time. There had been extensions granted, which was unusual, which indicated that someone in the Northern Court had reason to be patient, and patience among the old bloodlines was never accidental. It was always strategic. The debt could not be repaid in currency. The Dravian bloodline had more currency than the Southern Territories produced in a decade. What they were offering, the men said carefully, was a resolution, a permanent one. A member of the household, female, unmarried, of age, would be received at Ashenvale Castle as a guest of the court. Guest, Lena noticed. Not prisoner. Not bride. Guest, she understood immediately what that word was doing there. It was doing the same work as the politeness, as the graycoats, as the dawn timing. It was making something unavoidable sound like a choice. She said yes before her mother could speak. She did not say it loudly. She said it the way you say things when you have decided to stop negotiating with a situation and simply move through it. She said it, and then she went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and looked at her hands for a long time. And then she stood up and began to pack. She took practical things. A second pair of boots. Her warmest coat. The small book of maps her grandmother had left her because she had always found maps comforting. The idea that places could be named and bounded and understood. A photograph of her mother taken the summer Lena was 8, standing in the bakery doorway, laughing at something outside the frame. She folded it carefully and put it at the bottom of the bag. She did not take the dress her mother pushed into her arms at the door, the one they saved for occasions. She did not want to arrive looking like she had dressed for something. She wanted to arrive looking exactly like what she was, which was a woman who had made a practical decision and intended to survive it. Her mother held her for a long time at the gate, said her name twice. Lena. Lena. In that particular way, that meant she was being asked to remember something. She wasn't sure what. She thought perhaps her mother wasn't sure either. Sometimes the important thing is just the name, just the reminder that you have one, that someone gave it to you and still says it like it matters. The carriage had no windows. She had expected this to feel like being buried. It felt instead like being made to wait. which was worse in some ways because waiting required her brain to keep working, to keep arranging and rearranging what she knew and what she didn't know, and what she was walking into. She knew the name. Ashenvale, she knew the bloodline. Drevian, she knew the reputation the way everyone in the South knew it, which was in fragments, in stories, in warnings that were half superstition and half something more considered. The Drevian king was old. 600 years, some said. More, said others. He had not taken a human into his court in over a century, and the last one had not come back, though accounts differed on whether that was a tragedy or eventually something else. She thought about that. She thought about the word eventually. She was 22 years old. She had run her mother's bakery since she was 16. She had never been kissed. She had never been farther north than the market town 3 days' ride from their village, and she had been alone there, had managed it, had found her way back. She held these facts like stones in her pocket. Heavy, real, countable. The carriage stopped. She heard the sound of a gate, iron on iron, and then gravel under the wheels, and then silence of a particular kind, the kind that belongs to large enclosed spaces, spaces old enough to have developed their own acoustics. She sat straight. She breathed. She waited for the door. The door opened, and the cold came in first. Not the cold of winter, which she knew and had dressed for. Something older than that. Something that had been living in stone for centuries and had given up trying to be anything else. She stepped out, and her boots met cobblestones slicked with frost, and she steadied herself without grabbing the door frame, which felt important. Ashenvale Castle was not what the stories had made it. The stories had made it enormous and black and somehow theatrical, the kind of structure that existed to be frightening, all towers and gargoyles and deliberate menace. What stood in front of her in the pale morning light was enormous. Yes, that much was accurate, but it was also just very old. Old in the way that made the stones look tired. Old in the way that meant centuries of weather had rounded the edges of things and darkened the walls to a color that was not quite gray and not quite brown, but something in between. Something that had stopped being any particular color and simply become itself. There were lights in the windows. Real ones, candles behind glass, warm and small. She had not expected the lights. A woman came across the courtyard to meet her. Human, Lena registered immediately, from the warmth of her face and the particular way she moved, which was brisk and efficient and entirely untheatrical. Middle-aged, dark hair pulled back, wearing a gray dress with a white collar, and the expression of someone who had done this before and found it manageable. "Nadia," the woman said, "I manage the household. You must be cold. Come inside. Not you must be frightened. Not you must have questions. You must be cold," which was practical and true and somehow exactly right. Lena followed her through a door into a corridor that smelled of wood smoke and something older underneath, stone and damp and centuries of use. Sconces burned along the walls at regular intervals. The floor was flagged and uneven in the way of old floors, worn by enough feet over enough years that it had taken on the shape of its own history. They walked for several minutes. Lena counted turnings. 4 left, 1 right, up a staircase, down a shorter one. She was building a map in her head the way she always did in new places, cataloging exits and directions, though she didn't know yet what she would do with the information. Know it first. Decide later. The room Nadia brought her to was on the 2nd floor, south-facing, which Lena noted because south-facing meant morning light, and morning light was something she had always valued more than she could exactly explain. The room was large. A fireplace already burning, 2 chairs positioned toward it, a writing desk with a lamp, and a stack of books. A wardrobe standing open to show clothes arranged inside, more than she had brought, more than she owned. A window seat with thick cushions in dark blue. A bed against the far wall, high off the ground, covered in something deep green, with actual steps built up against the side of it. She looked at the steps for a moment. Someone had thought about proportions. Someone had noticed that a human woman of ordinary height might need steps to reach a bed built for a vampire's length, and had arranged them there quietly, without ceremony, as if it were simply practical rather than a form of consideration. She didn't know what to do with that. Nadia moved through the room, pointing things out in a businesslike way. Hot water available in the bathing room, something about pipes from a heated source beneath the castle. Breakfast would come in the morning, or she could request it now. The castle library was on the 3rd floor, and she was welcome to use it. The gardens, such as they were at this time of year, were accessible through a door on the ground floor, east side. She was not restricted from any part of the castle, with the exception of the lower levels, which required an escort, and the king's private rooms, which required an invitation. She was not restricted, Nadia said again, as if she understood that Lena had noted the word the first time and wanted her to know it was not accidental. Questions? Nadia said. 1. When do I meet him? Nadia's expression did not change, but something in it settled, like a question she had been waiting to hear answered itself by being asked. Tonight, Nadia said. He'll come to you here, after the evening meal. He prefers to meet people without an audience. Prefers, Lena noticed. Not requires, not demands. Prefers, she filed that too. When Nadia left, Lena stood in the middle of the room for a moment with her bag still in her hand and looked at everything around her carefully, the way she looked at a new recipe, taking inventory before beginning. Then she put the bag down. She took off her coat. She hung it on the hook behind the door. She crossed to the window seat and sat down and looked out at the courtyard below, where the frost was beginning to lift off the cobblestones in the thin morning sun. She was a punishment. She was clear on this. The word the gray-coated men had not used, but that had been present in everything they said, in the structure of the arrangement itself. Her father had offended someone in the northern court, had defaulted on a debt that was not just financial, and she was the consequence. She was not a bride. She was not a guest. She was a message. A demonstration that the Drevian bloodline could reach into the south and collect what it was owed. She thought about that for a long time. Then she thought about the steps beside the bed. She picked up one of the books from the desk, opened it to the first page, and began to read. He came at the 9th hour. She knew it was him, before the door opened, which surprised her because she had expected not to know, had expected to feel nothing particular until the moment itself arrived. Instead, there was a change in the corridor, something in the quality of the silence beyond the door, a compression of it, and then a single knock. Precise, not a courtesy knock, not the performed hesitation of someone who is only technically asking permission, a real one, someone who actually intended to wait for her answer. "Come in," she said. He was tall. This registered first because it registered physically, the way the door frame related to him, the way he had to be aware of it. Dark coat. No adornments, the kind of clothes that cost a great deal but communicated nothing about themselves. Dark hair, cut shorter than she had imagined from the stories, which had given him something more dramatic. Sharp face, the kind of bone structure that looked engineered rather than grown. Pale in the way that was not illness, but simply the absence of sun over a very long time. He looked at her, she looked at him. He was not what she had been afraid of, which was the thing she had not expected. She had been afraid of something cold and theatrical, something that would make her smallness immediately clear. What she got instead was a man who stood in her doorway and looked at her steadily and said nothing for 3 seconds. And in those 3 seconds, she had the distinct impression he was being extremely careful. He crossed to the chair farther from the fire and sat down. Not the one nearer to her, the farther one. He sat without spreading himself into the space, without performing ease. Just sat, and looked at the fire for a moment. And then looked back at her. "I imagine," he said, "that you have been told a number of things about why you are here." His voice was lower than she had expected. "Unhurried, yes," Lena said. "Some of them will be accurate." He paused. "Some will be the version of events that was convenient to tell you." She watched him. "And which version is the convenient one?" He was quiet for a moment. He looked at the fire. The thing about his face, she was beginning to understand, was that it was not blank. It was controlled. There was a difference. Blank meant nothing moving beneath. Controlled meant something moving that he had decided not to show yet, which was, in its way, more interesting. "Your father's debt," he said finally, "is real. The arrangement is real, but the framing of it, as punishment, as consequence," he paused. "That framing was chosen by people who needed to explain a decision they didn't fully understand to a family who needed a reason they could accept." She stayed very still. "What decision?" He looked at her directly. "The one I made 2 years ago, when I extended the debt rather than calling it." She turned this over carefully. "You extended it. For 2 years. Why?" "I was waiting." "For what?" "For the right resolution," he said. And then he stopped, as if he had said slightly more than he intended, and looked back at the fire. The room was quiet. Outside the window, the wind had picked up, and she could hear it in the eaves, a low, constant sound. The fire shifted and settled. She sat with her hands loose in her lap and thought about the word waiting, and what it meant in the context of a man who had been alive for 600 years, to whom 2 years was perhaps nothing, perhaps a breath, perhaps exactly the length of time required to be certain. "You wrote a list," she said. He looked at her. She watched something cross his face. Surprise first, then something more careful. "Nadia told me," Lena said, "that you sent instructions ahead, about the room. The books, the south-facing window." He was quiet. She had also wondered, she said, about the steps beside the bed. A pause. "They were there already," he said, "from the previous occupant of the room." She looked at him. He held her gaze for a moment. "They were not there before this afternoon," he said. And then, very quietly, something at the corner of his mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same family as one. "I had them added. The previous occupant would have had no use for them." She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her chest did something she didn't have a word for yet. Not warmth, exactly. Something more cautious than warmth. The thing that comes just before you decide to trust something. The moment right before the decision, when you are still assessing, but the assessment is beginning to tilt. "I'm not going to pretend," Lena said, "that I wasn't frightened on the way here." "I know," he said. "I'm not frightened now. I know that too." She looked at the fire. Across from her, he was quiet in the particular way that meant he was listening rather than simply waiting for her to finish. She had known very few people who listened like that. It was rarer than it should have been. "I have questions," she said. "Ask them." "Not tonight." She looked at him. "I need to think about which ones matter first." He nodded, as if this was entirely reasonable, as if a woman arriving in his castle as a supposed punishment, asking for time to order her questions, was exactly the kind of thing he had anticipated and found sensible. He stood. Eventually, the movement was unhurried, entirely without the performance she kept expecting and kept not getting. "Sleep," he said. The castle is yours to move through. Tomorrow, or whenever you're ready." He crossed to the door. "Lena," he said, without turning. She looked up. "My name is Rael." Not what the stories say. Not the title. He paused, hand on the frame. Just that. Then, he was gone, and she was alone with the fire and the sound of the wind, and the steps beside the bed that had not been there before that afternoon, and the strange, specific, unexpected weight of being somewhere that was trying, quietly, to make room for her. She did not sleep for a long time, not from fear, which was what she had expected to keep her awake. From thinking, which was different. Her brain was doing the thing it did when she was working through a problem, turning the available information over carefully, examining it from different angles, checking it against what she already knew. She did this with recipes. She did this with the bakery accounts. She was apparently going to do it with this. What she had, a room that had been arranged with specific attention to her comfort. A man who had said his name without ceremony, and then left without pressure. Steps beside a bed. A south-facing window, books chosen for a range of people, not for a type. What she didn't have, any clear explanation of what was actually expected of her. What she was here to do, to be, to become. The word guest still sat in her mind with its edges of inaccuracy, not quite fitting the shape of the situation, but not entirely wrong either. She slept eventually, and woke to gray light, and the smell of wood smoke, and the sound of the castle doing its morning things, distant and ordinary. Footsteps somewhere below. Voices, briefly, and then not. The particular sound of large spaces inhabited by people going about their business. Breakfast arrived with a knock and a girl of perhaps 16, human, who left a tray without quite meeting her eyes and said there was no requirement to come down, which Lena noted was different from saying there was no permission to come down. She ate at the window seat and looked out at the courtyard below. Frost still on the stones at this hour, the sun not yet reaching the eastern wall. Two figures crossed below her, speaking to each other in low voices, both of them pale in the way that meant they were not human, moving with that slightly too deliberate quality she was beginning to associate with people who had learned over centuries to moderate what they naturally were. She watched them until they were gone. Then, she stood up, put on her coat, and went to find the library. It was where Nadia had said, 3rd floor, which required 1 staircase and 2 corridors and a left turn she nearly missed. The door was heavy, dark wood, and opened onto 2 rooms of shelves floor to ceiling, with brass-railed ladders, and a window seat on the far wall deep enough to be its own small space. Light coming through in a column that hit the floor at an angle and made the dust in the air briefly visible and briefly beautiful. She stood in the doorway for a moment. Then, she went in. She found history first, several shelves of it, organized by territory rather than date, which was unusual and suggested whoever had arranged them thought in terms of geography before chronology. She found the Northern Territory section and pulled a volume that looked well used, its spine cracked, and the pages soft from handling. She took it to the window seat and opened it and read for an hour, and it was dry and dense and occasionally interrupted by marginalia in a small, careful hand that noted disagreements with the text, and occasionally, twice, drew small maps in the margins to correct something the author had apparently gotten wrong. She ran her finger along one of the margin maps. Someone had cared very much about accuracy. "You found the library." She looked up. He was standing in the doorway. Not Rael. Someone else, younger looking, though she had already learned to distrust that word in this place. Dark skin, close-cropped hair, wearing clothes that managed to be elegant without appearing to try, leaning against the doorframe with his arms loosely crossed and an expression of open curiosity that was entirely without the careful management she had seen on Rael's face. "Is that a problem?" she said. He smiled. "No, I'm Cavan. Rael's younger brother. Significantly younger. Only 214. He said it like a joke. She suspected for a vampire it was. "He didn't tell me about you," she said. "He doesn't lead with information." Cavan came into the library and dropped into a chair across from her with the boneless ease of someone who had never once been required to perform dignity. He thinks information given too quickly isn't trusted. He makes everything a test without meaning to. She looked at the book in her lap. "And the marginalia in here," she said. "That's his handwriting?" Cavan glanced at the page. Since approximately 1680, yes, he has opinions about cartographic accuracy. She looked at the small, careful map in the margin. "So I see." "You're not what I expected," Cavan said. "Everyone here seems to say that. What were you expecting people to say?" She thought about it honestly. Something about the debt, the duty. What an arrangement like this means. Cavan made a face. "We leave that language to the advisors. They're very good at it." Rael finds it. He paused, searching for the word. "Reductive." She looked at him. "What does he find it reductive of?" Cavan tilted his head. The people involved. He was quiet for a moment. And then he said, more carefully, he didn't want to do this the way it's been done before. He wasn't sure how to do it differently. He's been thinking about it for 2 years. She looked out the window. The angle of the light had shifted, the column of it moving across the floor as the sun climbed. "He was up before dawn," Cavan said. "He does that when he has something he's working through. He sat in the map room for 3 hours this morning, looking at the southern territories. Your village specifically." She was very still. "He's trying to understand," Cavan said simply. "Where you came from, what the landscape looks like, what it would feel like to leave it." He paused. "He doesn't know how to ask you directly yet. So he researches. It's his way of caring about something before he knows whether he's allowed to." She looked at her hands, the book in her lap, the careful small map in the margin drawn by someone who thought accuracy mattered enough to correct a published author by hand in the margin of a book that probably no one else would ever read. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me." Cavan unfolded himself from the chair. "Don't tell him I told you. He'll be insufferable about it." Then he was gone, and she was alone in the library, with the light moving across the floor and the book in her hands, and the completely unexpected, cautious, specific feeling of a situation that was not what she had been told it was, and might be, slowly, becoming something she didn't have a word for yet. Rael found her in the library that evening. She heard the change in the corridor first, that particular compression of sound she was already beginning to recognize, and then he was in the doorway. He had been in what Nadia had called the council room all day, and it showed in a way that was not quite tiredness, but something close, something in the angle of his shoulders, the slight loosening of his usual containment. He saw her and stopped. "You found the library," he said. "Your brother told me you study maps of places before you meet the people from them," she said. The pause was longer than his usual ones. Something moved across his face that she recognized now as the expression he wore when calculating how much to admit. "Cavan talks too much. He talks exactly the right amount." She set down the book. "The marginalia in the 1680 history. That's yours." He came into the library and sat in the chair Cavan had used, looked at the shelves for a moment. Then at her. "I have opinions about cartographic accuracy," he said. "So I gathered." She held his gaze. "You've been looking at maps of my village." He didn't deny it. "I wanted to understand what the land there looks like, the scale of things, what you would have been able to see from your window." "Why?" "Because you came here without choosing to," he said. And I thought the least I could do was try to understand what that cost. What the distance felt like from your end. She was quiet. The fire shifted. Outside, the wind had dropped, and the night was very still and very dark through the library windows. No moon yet, just the quality of darkness that belongs to places far from other lights. Your father's debt, she said. What was it actually for? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, 10 years ago he came north with a trading consortium. They were seeking access to the mineral routes through our territory. Standard negotiation. He paused. He also separately passed information to a court in the Eastern Territories that was at the time in conflict with us. Not information that caused damage, but information that wasn't his to share. She absorbed this. And the debt. A consequence, Rael said, but extended, because the information was minor and the man seemed to understand what he had done, and because he stopped. Because what? He looked at her directly. Because I wanted the resolution to be something other than the usual kind. She held his gaze. And what is the usual kind? Currency, territory, something transactional. He was very still. I've had enough of transactional resolutions. They resolve nothing. They just move the debt somewhere else. She thought about this carefully. And what is this instead? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she thought he might not answer, might retreat back behind the careful distance, the controlled surface. Then, he said, I don't know yet. I'm trying to find out. She looked at him, at the stillness of him, the deliberate quality of his attention, the way he occupied a space without filling it theatrically. 600 years old, give or take, according to the books she had been reading. 600 years of accumulating that particular kind of careful. You wrote notes, she said, before I arrived, about what I might find frightening. He was still. Where did you hear that? Cavan, she said. A very long pause. Then, it seemed like the minimum responsible preparation. What was on the list? He looked at the fire. Everything, he said quietly. The journey, the castle, the court, the language barrier, the expectations. He paused. The wedding night assumption, which I wanted you to understand was not an assumption I shared. He stopped again. I wrote it out because I find that writing things down forces honesty. It's harder to be vague when you have to commit something to paper. She absorbed this. How many pages? 5. She looked at him. He looked back. Something at the corner of his mouth, that near smile that lived there like it was waiting for permission. That's a great deal of honesty, she said. I had a great deal to be honest about. She looked at her hands in her lap. Then, back at him. The fire between them warm, and the library quiet, and outside the castle the darkness complete, and the night doing what northern nights did in winter, which was simply to be enormous and unhurried, and unconcerned with the small warm rooms inside it. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask, what do you actually want from this? Not the arrangement, not the resolution. She met his gaze. What do you want? He was quiet for longer than she expected, long enough that she began to wonder if the question was one he hadn't been asked before, or one he hadn't been honest with himself about, or both. Then he said, I want someone who tells me true things. He paused. I've been surrounded for a very long time by people who tell me useful things, and accurate things, and strategic things. He looked at her. True things are different. She held his gaze. True things are harder. Yes, he said. That's why I want them. She was quiet. He was quiet. The fire burned, and the night was still outside, and somewhere below the castle its ordinary life continued. Footsteps and voices and the sounds of a large old place going about its centuries. I'll think about it, she said. He stood. That's all I'm asking." He crossed to the door, and she had the impression again, as she had had the night before, that he was being extremely careful not to take up more space than he'd been given. He paused at the door. "The map you were looking at," he said, without turning. "The one I corrected in the margin. The original cartographer was working from reports, not observation. He got the river wrong by 4 miles. She looked at the book in her lap. "Does it matter?" 4 miles? He turned. "Just enough. To the people who live along that river," he said, "it matters completely." Then, he was gone. She sat for a long time with the book in her hands, and the near smile in her memory, and the particular weight of being told, by a 600-year-old king who wrote 5 pages of notes before she arrived, that the truth of where things actually are matters completely. 3 weeks passed. She learned the shape of things. The castle had its rhythms the way the bakery had had rhythms, the way all living systems do, and she had always been good at rhythms, at understanding the pattern before the pattern repeated enough to be obvious. Breakfast happened early, the kitchen active before dawn, because Rael kept unusual hours, and the household had organized itself around that centuries ago. The council sessions were 3 mornings a week, long and apparently contentious, held in a room on the ground floor that she walked past once, and heard 4 voices in sharp disagreement, and 1 voice, low and entirely without agitation, that she recognized. The library was hers in the afternoons. This had not been formally arranged, but had somehow become true, the way things become true in shared spaces, through a combination of habit and the tacit agreement of everyone involved. Nadia brought tea at the 2nd hour, without being asked. Cavan appeared irregularly, dropped into his chair, talked at her about whatever was on his mind, with the complete comfort of someone who has decided a friendship is already established and finds the early stages of establishing it redundant. She found she did not mind this. She found, in fact, that she liked it, that she was looking forward to the afternoons in a way she hadn't expected. Rael came to the library in the evenings. This also had not been formally arranged. It had simply begun, on the 2nd evening, when she looked up from a book about Eastern bloodline history, and he was in the doorway again, and she had said come in, and he had come in and sat in his chair, which she had already begun thinking of as his chair. And they had talked for 2 hours, and she had lost track of time entirely. They talked about maps, about history, specifically the places where the historical accounts disagreed with each other, and what that disagreement suggested about who had written them, and why. About the bakery, which he asked about in detail that surprised her, not politely, but with genuine curiosity, asking specific questions about the process of bread, about the particular variables of humidity and temperature, about what it felt like to know a thing well enough to feel when it was wrong before you could articulate why. She told him about her mother, about the way she read weather in her body before the sky showed anything, decades of early mornings making her a better instrument than any glass, about the summer when the well had gone bad and they had had to carry water from the river for 6 weeks, and her mother had simply adjusted, had recalculated, had figured out what was still possible within the new constraints, and done that instead. He listened with his whole face, the way she had noticed the first night. She had known very few people who listened like that. She was beginning to understand it was not a performance. It was simply how he paid attention to things. He told her, gradually in pieces, about the territories, the political geography of the northern reaches, the bloodline alliances and tensions, the specific difficulty of governing something that had been built over centuries by people with different frameworks for what governing meant. He told her about the Eastern Council and its current posture, which was expansionist and clever about hiding that it was expansionist. He told her about the trade routes and why the mineral access had been significant back when her father had come north, and what it had meant when that information had moved sideways. He did not tell her everything at once. He told her in the same way he had arranged the room, in the way he had put the steps beside the bed, with attention to what was useful and what was too much, and where the line between those things was. She found she trusted the withholding. She had met people who withheld because they didn't want you to have things. This felt like the opposite. This felt like someone who was trying to give her things in an order that made sense. On the 18th day, she asked him about the previous human who had come to Ashenvale, the one in the stories, the one who hadn't come back. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "She came back." Lena looked at him. "The story that she didn't is easier to tell," he said. "The actual story is that she came here under similar circumstances to yours, remained for 6 months, and then chose to stay. She's in the Western Reaches now. She married a man from the court there. She has 3 children. I attended the naming ceremony for the youngest 2 years ago." Lena was quiet. "And the story that she didn't come back," he looked at the fire, "is told by people who found the real version inconvenient, who needed the North to remain frightening, for their own reasons. She absorbed this. Why are you telling me this? Because you asked a true question," he said, "and you deserve a true answer." She looked at him, at the fire, at her hands in her lap, and then back at him. "I told my mother not to worry," she said, "in the letter I sent. I told her I was all right. Was that true?" She thought about it honestly, the way she had come to understand he expected her to. "Yes," she said. "It was true when I wrote it, and it's more true now." Something in his face settled. Not visibly, not dramatically. The way a room settles when a window is closed against wind, a small shift in the quality of the air. He reached across and poured tea from the pot Nadia had left, pushed her cup toward her without comment, picked up his own glass, and looked at the fire. She picked up her cup, drank, the fire warm, the evening dark outside, the castle quiet around them, and 3 weeks of evenings in this room accumulated between them like a kind of language neither of them had named yet. She was starting to think she recognized some of the words. On the 26th day it snowed. Not the light, uncertain snow of early winter, but the real kind. The kind that committed, falling in the blue dark of before dawn, and still falling when she looked. Out the window at 7, and still falling at noon when she pressed her face to the cold glass of the library window and watched it cover the courtyard in something clean and final and without any previous version of itself underneath. She had grown up with snow. She knew it well. She still found herself affected by it in a way she couldn't entirely explain. Something about the quality of light it created, the way it simplified surfaces, turned complicated ground into one even thing. She was standing at the library window when Rael appeared behind her, not in the doorway this time, already in the room, already having crossed to stand beside her with the quietness that was simply how he moved, the absence of unnecessary sound. She hadn't heard him come in. She wasn't startled. Which was the thing she noticed after, that she wasn't startled. She kept looking out the window. He stood beside her and looked out also, and they were quiet together for a moment, which had become a thing they did, which had become, she realized, comfortable. "You grew up with this," he said. "Yes, different though. Southern snow is softer." She glanced at him. "This is more serious. Everything here is more serious." He wasn't quite smiling. Almost. She looked back at the snow. "In our village there's a field behind the bakery. When the snow was good, deep enough, and not yet frozen, my mother used to close the shop for an hour, and we'd go out and just stand in it." She paused. She said the world had less opinions in the snow, less noise. He was quiet. Then, "Your mother sounds like someone who understood proportion." "She does." Lena looked at the courtyard below, The fountain at its center now, just a shape under white, the cobblestones invisible. I miss her. He said nothing to this, which was exactly right. She hadn't been asking for comfort. She had been saying a true thing, the way she had learned he expected, and he received it the way he received all true things, which was simply by not flinching from it. After a moment he said, "She can visit. When the roads are better. If you want." She looked at him. Directly, he was still watching the snow. "You'd allow that?" He looked at her then, and something in his face was slightly different, something slightly more unguarded than usual. "This is your home," he said. "You can have people here." She held his gaze. "You keep saying things like that." "What things?" "Things that assume I'm staying." She watched him carefully. "That assume this is actually my life now, rather than an arrangement I'm tolerating." He held her gaze without blinking. "Are you not?" She looked back at the snow. Thought about it honestly, which she had learned was the only way to think in this place. About the library, about the evenings by the fire, about Kevin in his chair, about Nadia and the tea, and the specific satisfaction of a household that worked, and worked well, about the south-facing window and the morning light, and the small map in the margin of a history book that had mattered because accuracy mattered, about the steps beside the bed. "I don't know yet," she said. "But I'm not tolerating it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's enough," he said. She looked at him sideways, a 600-year-old king who considered not tolerating it enough. She wanted to tell him that was very practical, but something stopped her. Something about the way he said it, like he meant it precisely, like enough was not a consolation prize but an actual measure of something. She looked at the snow falling straight down in the windless cold. "Can you feel temperature?" she asked. "Or is that not how it works?" "I feel it differently," he said. "Not as discomfort, more as information." He was quiet. "Cold registers as age. It reminds me of things. How old does this feel?" He looked at the snow for a long moment. "Old," he said, "in a way that is not unpleasant." She thought about that. About having centuries of cold in your memory, what kind of library that would be, every winter you had stood in stacked behind the current one. All of them available. "What do you remember most?" she said. "In all of it. What stays?" He was quiet so long she thought he might not answer. Then, "The things that were smaller than I expected," he said. "When I was young, I thought what would stay would be the large events, the conflicts, the resolutions, the century markers." He paused. "What actually stays is the other things. A particular afternoon. A quality of light I saw once through a window in the eastern reaches and have never seen replicated. A conversation I had with someone I barely knew who said something true about fear that I have been thinking about for 200 years. She looked at him. He looked back. His face in profile, then forward, the controlled surface slightly different in the gray snowlight, slightly more available. "What did they say?" she asked. "About fear." He thought. "That fear is usually about the gap between what you have and what you might lose. That when the gap closes, when you have less to lose or nothing to lose, the fear goes with it." He paused. They meant it as consolation. I was young enough to find it bleak instead. "And now?" He looked at the snow. "Now I think they were right and wrong simultaneously," he said. "The gap is the problem, yes, but the solution isn't to close it by having less. It's to close it by having more, by having enough that the fear stops being proportionate to the having." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You're talking about this, aren't you?" She didn't look at him. "This particular gap." He said nothing for a moment. "Then yes." She looked at the snow. It was still falling, patient and committed, covering everything with the same even white, the same willingness to make the world temporarily simple. She thought about proportion, about her mother, closing the shop for 1 hour when the snow was right. "I'll write to her," she said. About the visit. He said nothing. She had learned this meant yes. Her mother arrived in the 4th month. The roads had cleared 2 weeks prior, and the message had gone south with a courier, and the answer had come back in her mother's handwriting, which Lena recognized from across the room before she could read the words. The particular way she formed her letters, slightly forward-leaning, as if they were moving towards something. She would come. She said so without elaborating, which was her way. She came. Lena watched the carriage cross the courtyard from the library window, watched her mother step out, a small woman in a practical coat, and look up at the castle with the expression Lena recognized as her assessment face, the one she used for new suppliers and uncertain weather and anything that required honest evaluation before deciding what to do with it. She was down the stairs before Nadia reached the door. Her mother held her in the courtyard for a long time. Neither of them spoke. Her mother smelled like bread, and the particular cold of the carriage, and something underneath both that was just her, specific and irreplaceable, and Lena pressed her face against her shoulder and felt something loosen in her chest that she had not known was still held. Then her mother held her back by the shoulders and looked at her face with the same assessment expression she had turned on the castle. "You look," her mother said, "different. Better or worse?" Her mother studied her. "Neither," she said. "Just different. Like something that was pulled tight is not anymore." Lena thought about this. "Yes," she said. "That's accurate. Her mother stayed for 6 days. She was given a room 2 doors from Lena's and showed no interest in the question of whether this was adequate, simply went to the window and looked out and said the light was good, then asked Nadia where the kitchen was and whether she was allowed to use it, because she couldn't sleep in a strange place without baking something. Nadia, who had run this household for a long time and been surprised by very little, showed her to the kitchen without blinking. The castle smelled different the next morning. Lena smelled it from the corridor before she reached the kitchen stairs, the specific warmth of bread just out, the sweet particular smell of something with spice, and felt something happen in the back of her throat that she couldn't entirely explain. She had not realized she had been missing that smell. She had been too busy learning the smell of this place to notice what was absent. Rael met her mother on the 2nd day. Lena had not arranged this formally. It happened because her mother, characteristically, had gone for a walk in the courtyard in the early afternoon, and Rael had been crossing it on his way from the eastern gate, and they had simply been in the same space at the same time. She watched from the library window, not close enough to hear. Her mother stood and looked at him the way she had looked at the castle, with the same honest assessment, unhurried. He stood very still and let her look, which Lena suspected was not a thing he normally did, letting people look at him that directly without doing anything about it. They spoke for perhaps 15 minutes. She could not see her mother's face, but she knew every expression in her mother's body, the set of her shoulders, the angle of her head. She watched the assessment give way to something that wasn't quite approval, but was in the same direction. That evening her mother found her in the library. "He prepared," her mother said, without preamble. Lena looked up. "What?" "He prepared." Her mother sat down in Cavan's chair, which she did without ceremony, filling it in an entirely different way, with the solidity of someone who is comfortable in chairs. "He knew I was nervous about traveling in winter. He asked someone to look at the road conditions 3 days before I left and sent a report back with the courier." She paused. "He had the kitchen make something he was told I liked. I don't know how he found out what I liked. I didn't tell anyone." Lena was quiet. She thought about the maps, about the notes, about 5 pages of things someone might be afraid of. "He researches," she said, It's how he cares about things before he knows whether he's allowed to. Her mother looked at her steadily. The assessment face, quieter now, the evaluation part finished. "You're not afraid of him," her mother said. "No, you were." "Yes," she met her mother's gaze. "I was afraid on the way here. I'm not anymore." Her mother was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the particular voice she used for true things, "Is this home now?" Lena thought about it honestly, about the library and the evenings and the snow in the courtyard, and the map in the margin and Kevin in his chair, and Nadia and the tea and Rael standing beside her at the window looking at snow, saying old in a way that was not unpleasant. "I think it's becoming that," she said. "I think it's somewhere in the middle of becoming that." Her mother nodded. "Like bread," she said. "You can't rush the rise." Lena looked at her. "That's either very wise or completely obvious." Her mother smiled. "Usually both." She stood. "He's not what I expected. Everyone here says that about me. I mean," she moved toward the door. "He's careful the way your father was never careful. Like he's thought about what things cost people." She paused. "That's not nothing. That's actually quite a lot." She left. Lena sat in the library for a long time afterward, looking at the fire, thinking about care and cost, and the particular weight of being somewhere that had started, slowly and without announcement, to feel like something she would miss. The 5th month was the hardest. Not because anything went wrong, because nothing did, and the absence of catastrophe left her with no defense against the thing that was happening, which was that she had stopped performing adaptation and started simply living. She knew the kitchen now, knew which hours the cook was in a talking mood, and which she preferred silence, and which shelf held the dried herbs her mother had asked about, and sent a packet of South Sea salt for, which had appeared on the correct shelf 3 days after her mother's visit, without anyone mentioning it. She knew the library's geography without thinking about it, knew which section held which histories and which shelf had the collection of old letters she had found in the 3rd week and had been reading in sequence, the correspondence of a bloodline matriarch from 4 centuries ago who wrote with a directness that Lena admired. She knew Kevin's particular knock, which was never a single tap but always 3 in a regular rhythm. And she knew that if he came and she didn't answer, he would come back in an hour and try again. Not because he needed anything, but because he found the idea of her being alone in there, without company, slightly troubling. She knew Rael's footstep. This she had not expected to learn. But she had learned it, the specific weight and pace of it, the way it changed depending on what kind of day he had, slightly more deliberate when the counsel had been difficult, something slightly freer when it hadn't. She heard him coming before he arrived, and she had stopped noting that she heard him, and simply registered it as information, the way she registered the weather through the window, the way her mother read the sky. This, she understood, was what it meant to have stopped performing. He noticed. Of course he noticed. He had been paying attention with that whole face quality since the first evening, and he was not a person things got past. He said nothing about it directly. He simply adjusted his own quality of presence, not pulling back, but meeting her somewhere, in the same territory, with the same degree of not performing. Their evenings in the library became longer without either of them deciding this. They started talking about things that were not about the arrangement, not about the territories or her past or his history, but about ideas, about questions with no practical application, whether the memories accumulated over centuries compressed or remained distinct, whether the specific slant of winter light she had described from her village was the same as the light he remembered from 6 centuries ago, and whether light was the kind of thing that changed or stayed. He had opinions on everything. This had taken her time to understand, because his delivery was so measured that it initially read as neutrality. But it wasn't neutrality. He had strong views, carefully held, offered without performance, and when she disagreed with them, which she did, frequently, he received her disagreement with genuine interest rather than management. This was, she realized, the rarest thing. Rarer than the steps by the bed or the 5 pages of notes or the map in the margin. The willingness to be disagreed with and find it useful. She told him this one evening. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You're the first person in a very long time who disagrees with me about things that matter rather than things that are safe." She looked at him. "What's the difference?" He considered. Safe disagreements are about preferences. Which route is faster? Whether a trade proposal is favorable. Things with correct answers that don't require anyone to change how they think. And the other kind? He looked at her. The other kind requires someone to believe you're worth arguing with, that your conclusion matters even if they believe it's wrong. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "I think your interpretation of the 4th century bloodline conflicts is sentimental." He raised an eyebrow, an actual eyebrow raise. She had not seen him do this before. "Sentimental," he said. "You attribute strategic decisions to loyalty that were almost certainly pure politics." She watched him. The accounts don't support the loyalty reading. The timing does, but timing is not motivation. He was quiet. Then he said, carefully, "I think you're right about the timing. I'm less convinced about the motivation." "Because?" "Because," he said, "I was there." He held her gaze, and the politics and the loyalty were not, in that case, separate things. She stared at him. "You were there." "I was younger," he said. "Much younger. 50 years, approximately, but present." He looked at the fire. "Motivation is frequently both at once. I have found this to be consistent across 6 centuries. She sat with this for a moment. Then, "You should have said that at the beginning." "I know." Something almost a smile. "I wanted to see where you'd take the argument." She looked at him steadily. "That's insufferable." "Yes," he said, and the almost smile became something more actual, and she felt something move through her chest with the force and specificity of something she recognized. She knew what it was. She had been knowing what it was for some time, she realized. She had simply been waiting until she was sure. She was sure. She told him on an ordinary evening. Not a significant one. No snow, no particular quality of light. Cavan had been in the library earlier and left his coat over the arm of his chair when he went, which he did periodically, and she had stopped mentioning because he always retrieved it eventually. The fire was ordinary. The hour was ordinary. She had been reading a collection of translated Southern poetry that she had found in a bottom shelf 3 weeks ago and had been working through slowly, 1 poem per evening. She set the book down. He was in his chair. He was reading correspondence, a letter he had been considering for 20 minutes by her estimate, turning it over in his hands occasionally and looking at it the way he looked at things he was being careful about. He looked up. She said, "I want you to know something." He set the letter down. Fully, not half down. She had noticed early on that when she spoke to him, he completed the action of receiving her, closed the previous thing completely, which was not a small thing to do. When I arrived, she said, "I told myself this was survivable." That's the word I used. Not in writing, just inside, to myself. Survivable. He said nothing. Listening, she looked at her hands. She had ink on her right index finger from writing letters that morning. She looked at it for a moment. "I don't think that anymore," she said. "It's not the word I'd use now." "What word would you use?" She looked at him. She considered telling him to find it himself, to look it up in one of his history books, to write a list and see which word appeared most often. She considered several things. Then she said the true one. The way she had learned was the only way worth talking here. Home, she said. I would use that word. He was very still. Not survivable, she said. Not an arrangement. Not a resolution to a thing that needed resolving. She held his gaze. I would say home, and I would mean it specifically. Not just the castle, and not just the library, and not just the south-facing window. She paused. I would mean you. The fire, the dark window, the coat on Cavan's chair. Everything in the room ordinary and present, and real. He said her name. Just that. The way her mother said her name at the gate, like a reminder that you have one, that someone gave it to you and still says it like it matters. She felt tears somewhere far back in her eyes and didn't let them happen. She blinked twice and breathed. I know, he said, that I am not uncomplicated. The words measured and honest, the way he said all words. I know that 600 years is a significant thing to be adjacent to. I know that I learned too late how to be warm in ways that are visible. He paused. I know that I am better at research than conversation, and better at lists than declarations. She looked at him. You do all right, she said, with declarations. He held her gaze. I would like, he said carefully, for the next 600 years to involve this. He did not gesture. He simply looked at her. You, specifically, she thought about proportion. About her mother closing the shop for 1 hour when the snow was right, because some things were worth stopping for. About the gap between what you have and what you might lose, and the way it closed not by having less, but by having enough. She thought she had enough. She thought she might have, unexpectedly everything. All right, she said. He crossed the room in the quiet, unhurried way he did everything, and sat beside her on the window seat, and she moved slightly to make room, which she had not had to think about, which was just what you do when you know someone's dimensions in space, and he was close and the fire warm behind them and the dark of the window in front. She leaned her head against his shoulder. His arm came around her, quiet and steady. What happens now? She said. Practically, he was quiet for a moment. Now we have dinner, he said, and then we talk about what you want the next month to look like. And after that we figure out the month after that. That's very practical. I am a practical person. You put steps beside a bed because you thought about my height before I arrived, she said. That is not a practical person. That is something else. He was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said softly. It is. She stayed where she was, his shoulder solid and cool, his arm steady, the fire warm, and the night doing what northern nights did, which was simply to be large and unconcerned and entirely indifferent to the small warm rooms inside it. And she found she did not mind the largeness anymore, found it had stopped feeling like something she needed to be defended from. She was inside it. She was warm. She was not afraid. Spring arrived without announcement. Not all at once. In increments, the way things in the north always happened, a few degrees at a time. The snow retreating from the lower courtyard while the peaks stayed white. The river in the valley running fast with meltwater she could hear at night if the wind was right. The first green in the castle grounds came up through cracked stone, in places it had probably been coming up through for centuries, persistent and entirely unbothered by the permanence around it. She stood in the courtyard on a morning in the 6th month and turned her face up to actual direct sun for the first time since autumn, and felt it on her skin the way her mother had always described it after a long winter. Like a greeting from something you hadn't realized you'd missed. 6 months since the carriage with no windows. 6 months since the dress 3 sizes too big that someone else had worn before her and that she had never thought of as hers. 6 months since the castle rising out of the blue-gray dawn and her boots on the frost-slicked cobblestones and the cold entering the room before anything else. She had changed. Not in ways she could have predicted from inside the carriage. She could hold her own in the council sessions now. Rael had started including her 3 months ago, informally at first, then less informally, then simply as a matter of course. She had opinions about the Eastern situation that she had stated and that had been argued with and occasionally incorporated, and she had found this process, the argument itself, deeply satisfying in a way she hadn't expected from anything that was technically political. Cavan had declared her permanently terrifying at the end of the 4th month and had meant it as the highest compliment. She had told him he was welcome, and he had laughed and told her she was worse than his brother. She had taken this also as a compliment. Her mother had written 4 letters since the visit, more than she usually wrote, because she was not, as she frequently said, a letter-writing person. She was a doing person, but apparently the particular thing she needed to do from the South was right, and so she had. The 4th letter had arrived last week, and had said, among the practical things about the bakery and the spring planting and the news of the village, that she thought she understood now. What Lena had meant, in her own letters, by the word home. She said she was glad. That was all. She said it once, plainly, and Lena had read it twice and folded the letter back into its envelope and sat quietly for a moment feeling the particular weight of being understood by someone who loved you. Rael found her in the courtyard. She heard the particular weight of his footstep on the stones, now as familiar as her own, and didn't turn immediately. She kept her face in the sun for another moment, collecting the warmth. He came to stand beside her. She could feel the temperature differential even without looking, the slight coolness that accompanied him, which was information rather than cold, and which she had stopped registering as different from herself. 6 months, he said. I know. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the castle walls, the south face catching the morning light. She had watched him do this before. Look at the place the way you look at something that surprised you by becoming yours. I want to write to my mother, she said. To tell her something. He looked at her. To tell her I'm not afraid anymore. And that she was right. About what? She smiled at the courtyard, the green coming up through the cracks. She said you couldn't rush the rise. He considered this. She sounds, he said, like someone who understands proportion. She understands everything, Lena said. She just waits until it's accurate to say so. He was quiet. She looked at the light on the castle walls, the particular gold of morning on old stone. She had watched it every clear day since she arrived. She had started to think of it as hers. She reached over and took his hand. He looked down at their hands, and then up at her. She held his gaze. His fingers were cool and still around hers, and she squeezed, and he squeezed back, which was all of it, really all of what she needed to say about the last 6 months in a language that didn't require words. I've been thinking about something, she said. Tell me. She looked at the mountain peaks still white while the courtyard below had cleared. About the gap between what you have and what you might lose. She looked at him. You told me about it, what that person said, that you were young enough then to find it bleak. He watched her. I don't think it's bleak, she said. I think it's accurate. I think the gap gets smaller, not by losing things, but by finding things worth having. She held his gaze. I think I'm not afraid of losing this, because I know now that it's real. And real things, she paused. Real things are worth being afraid of losing. That's not the fear. That's just knowing what something is worth. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, You're better at this than I am. At what? At saying true things, he said. Without the gap. She looked at him. You wrote 5 pages of notes about what a stranger might be afraid of. She tilted her head. You closed the gap before I arrived. Something moved across his face. The full version of it, not the almost smile, not the controlled surface. Something open and actual and entirely real. He raised her hand briefly and held it against his mouth, a small, quiet thing, no ceremony, and then held it between both of his and looked at the spring light on the mountains. "What happens now," she said, after a while. "We have a great deal of time," he said, "and I intend to spend most of it being curious about what you think about things." She laughed. He made a sound that was related to a laugh, slightly unpracticed. They stood in the spring courtyard together in the morning light, the mountains lightening as the sun climbed, the green coming up through old stone, and everything that had been large and frightening about this life, held inside something that was just the two of them standing in a courtyard, hands held, the cold and warm of each other, and real, and enough, and home. She had arrived as a punishment. She had never been sent back. She had not wanted to be. If this story made you feel something real, follow for more. New stories every week. She thought sometimes, in the quiet way she thought about things now, about the version of herself in the carriage. The woman with the cold tea and the practical bag, and the map book at the bottom for comfort. The woman who had said yes before her mother could speak because she had decided to stop negotiating with the situation and simply move through it. The woman who had pressed her forehead to the carriage wall and counted stones in the road and thought survivable. Just survivable. That's enough. She thought about how that woman had been right about something. The moving through it, the deciding not to negotiate with the given situation, but to find out what was true inside it. That part had been right. She had done it. She had moved through and found on the other side of it not what she had feared, and not what she had expected, and not anything she could have constructed from inside that windowless carriage, because you cannot imagine a life from inside the absence of it. You have to arrive. She was in the tower room when she thought these things, the room at the top of the east tower that she had found in the 3rd month and claimed quietly, telling no one. Which meant Rael knew within a day and said nothing. Which meant Cavan knew within 3 days and also said nothing. Which meant Nadia had sent someone to put cushions on the window seat without mentioning it. The view from the tower was the best in the castle. She had decided this scientifically, having viewed from every accessible window over the course of 6 months, which was not as excessive as it sounded, because the castle had a great many windows, and the light changed through all of them, and she had always believed in having an opinion based on actual evidence. The tower looked north and east, mountains on both axes, the peaks still holding their white in late spring, while the valleys had gone green, and the river ran visible as a silver line through the lowland. She could see the road in the distance, the one she had come in on. And she could see it not as the road of arrival, but simply as a road, one of several, going in several directions, some of which she had not yet taken. She had been making a list of places she wanted to see. This had started as a private thing, a document she kept in the tower, noting the places in the histories she had read that she wanted to actually visit and compare against the written accounts, which she had found frequently optimistic or misleading or simply wrong in the specific way that Rael's margin notes had identified, the gap between the report and the actual terrain. Rael had found the list 3 weeks ago, had picked it up from the table in the tower without asking, read through it with his whole face attention, set it down. He had said, "There are 14 places on this list I can take you." She had said, "And the other 6?" He had said, 2 are in the Eastern Territories, which requires a diplomatic negotiation we should have in spring. 2 are in the far north, which requires waiting for the passes to clear. 1 is underwater, which requires a different conversation. He paused. 1 I've never actually been to. She had looked at him. "You've never been there?" "In 600 years. It was in a territory that was closed to me for 2 centuries, he said. By the time it reopened I had. He was quiet for a moment. other things to attend to. She had looked at the list. And now? He had looked at her. And now, he said, I have someone to go with. She wrote this down in the small notebook she kept now in the tower. The one she had started in the second month as a way of keeping track of things she wanted to remember. Specific things. The quality of the light on a particular morning, things Cavan said that she wanted to have a record of, conversations she did not want to lose to time. She wrote, he has been waiting for someone to go with. She wrote it in her own handwriting, slightly forward-leaning, the way her mother had taught her, moving toward something. Rael came up the tower stairs an hour later. She heard his step on the stone, familiar and entirely itself. He came in and stood beside her at the window and looked at the same view she was looking at, the mountains and the river and the road, and the sky doing its spring thing, moving between cloud and sun rapidly, the light changing in sweeps across the valley below. The Eastern Territories, he said. I sent the first letter of negotiation this morning. She looked at him. How long will it take? He considered. The formal negotiation, a month. They will have questions about you specifically. The Eastern Court has not had a human in a political position for 80 years, and they have opinions about this. She looked back at the mountains. I have opinions too. I know. A very quiet version of the almost smile. I thought I'd let them find that out for themselves. She thought about the 22-year-old woman in the carriage, about what she had and had not known about herself then, about the very specific thing that had been present and undetected, the thing that Cavan had called terrifying, and Rael had called worth arguing with, and her mother had called different, the loosening of something that had been pulled too tight. She had not known what she was capable of. You don't, from inside the carriage, before you arrive. I want to add something to the list, she said. He looked at her. Not a place. She met his gaze. A thing. I want to add a thing. What thing? She had thought about how to say it. She had been turning it over for weeks in the specific way she turned over true things, checking it from different angles, making sure it was accurate before she said it out loud. She was sure now. I want to see what you were like at 50, she said. Not the history. Not the accounts. She held his gaze. I want to know what the world looked like to you before you learned to be careful with it. I want to learn that version. Over time. However long it takes. He was very still. She continued, I know it's not something you can tell me all at once. I know it's in pieces, distributed across centuries. I know some of it is probably not easy to tell. She held his gaze. I'm not asking for all of it now. I'm saying I'm interested in all of it. Eventually, across whatever time we have. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, we have a great deal of time. I know. The specific warmth of 600 years of patience in those 3 words, the particular quality of a man who had been waiting longer than most things, existed for something he had not known he was waiting for. She reached over and took his hand. He held it with the same steadiness he did everything, cool and certain and entirely present. And they stood at the tower window together and looked out at the spring light moving across the valley in sweeps and the mountains white at their peaks, and the road below going in its several directions. She was not in the carriage anymore. She was exactly where she had arrived to be, standing at the top of a tower with a view she had claimed as hers, holding the hand of a 600-year-old king who had put steps beside a bed before she arrived and written 5 pages of notes about what a stranger might fear, and who had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who would ask to know the version of him that existed before he learned to be careful. She was not a punishment. She had never been a punishment. She had been, from the moment the carriage stopped and the cold came in and her boots found the frost-slicked cobblestones, an arrival. And this, standing in the spring light with everything that had been large and frightening, now held inside something real and warm and hers. This was what arriving looked like when you stopped surviving it and started living in it. This was home. This had always, it turned out, been where she was going.